Hello and welcome once again to Bible Talk with Bruce and Becky. It is an unseasonably warm November afternoon here in Chattanooga. And without further ado, do you have any further ado?
I don't see it anywhere.
Okay, we left our further ado somewhere. Let's get into the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 2 of Mark in a section with Jesus in controversy with the religious authorities of his day, or how to interpret the scriptures and how to apply them to the Jewish people, and Mark is applying them to us and telling his story of Jesus. We concluded last time with Jesus healing a paralytic, a paralyzed man whose friends had let him down through the roof where Jesus was teaching. And Jesus had scandalized the scribes, the legal authorities of the time, by telling the man that his sins are forgiven. They saw this as blasphemy from Jesus. Now, in the midst of these controversy stories, we find out that Jesus called another disciple, in addition to the two sets of brothers, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, who were fishermen. Becky, will you please read from chapter 2, verse 13 through 17?
Jesus calls Levi. He went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Oh, excuse me. Sorry. And the scribes of the Pharisees. Huh?
For there were many who followed him. That's where we left off in the next verse. Go ahead, you stop in
And
the
the
middle of the sentence.
scribes of the Pharisees. What are the scribes of the Pharisees? They're the scribes of the Pharisees, I guess.
The
Okay.
scribes who belong to the party of the Pharisees. We'll talk
Oh,
about that
okay.
in a
They're
minute.
not inscribing for the Pharisees.
No,
They are
they're not.
Pharisees who do inscribing.
Yes.
When they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners."
Okay, that was a rather awkward beginning to our lesson today, interrupted by a phone call, which would not have happened in the time of the Gospel of Mark, and a bit of confusion about who the scribes of the Pharisees might be. So we'll try to clear that up. Jesus is still in Capernaum or Capernaum, which is at the seaside, the Sea of Galilee. And as he was passing along, he came across a toll booth where a tax collector was collecting customs or tolls on goods coming into the territory of Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee.
Are we talking about tariffs?
We could say tariffs, but we won't use that word because of the
Political implications.
political implications for our day. We're not going to get into modern politics, if at all possible. There's a man named Levi, son of Alphaeus, who is collecting these customs. This would be not only a seaside toll booth, but a crossroads where people would come into the territory of Galilee. And if they brought goods in with them, they had to pay a customs fee. And Levi was what would be known as a tax farmer, or some Gospels call him a chief tax collector. The way the tax system worked in Galilee and other Roman territories was that people bid for the right to collect taxes. The rulers would tell them how much tax they had to turn in, but they were free to charge as much as they could get away with, which meant that many of them were dishonest, if not all of them. They cheated people by charging more taxes than were due, and they kept the profit for themselves. That's why these people who are friends of Levi are called sinners by the Pharisees.
Ah, I wondered about that.
The Pharisees tended to say other people are sinners because they don't follow the law the way we do, and they would not have included themselves in the category of sinners.
So it's not Mark who's calling them sinners.
It's the Pharisees who asked the scribes who belonged to the Pharisee party, "Why does your master eat with tax collectors and sinners?" We might just mention a little bit about who the Pharisees were. They were the particular sect, S-E-C-T, of the Jews. There were several at that time, including Pharisees and Sadducees, who are mentioned most often in the Gospel. The Pharisees were very scrupulous about keeping the law, and they were often said to build a hedge around the law. That is, they added additional traditions to the written law in order to keep from breaking the written law. Jesus took issue at times with their oral tradition because he didn't see it as part of the real law of Moses, and it was often used to bind people unnecessarily with trying to keep the law. The scribes would be people who were specialists not only in writing, which not everybody could do at that time, but in transcribing the written law and interpreting it for people. They were the religious authorities of the day, and they often came in conflict with Jesus. Let's, before we move on, look at a couple more things in this little paragraph. And one is, I'm going to ask Becky, who is this person called Levi, son of Alphaeus? He's called to be a Pharisee of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus. But when we get to the list of the 12 disciples of Jesus, he's not found in any of those lists. There's no one named Levi.
Well, it's Matthew.
Well, how do you know?
Good question.
That's probably correct, but it's only an educated guess that Levi and Matthew are the same person. We'll say more about that when we get to the list of the 12 in chapter 3. But I wanted to point that out because if people go looking for Levi, they're not going to find him, except in this particular passage. And also notice this little answer that Jesus gives in verse 17 when they ask, "Why is Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus gives a little proverb. "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners," which probably made the Pharisees a bit uncomfortable because they saw themselves as the righteous. Is Jesus agreeing with them that they're really righteous and they have no need to come to him? What would you say he was doing?
We're all sinners. And
Yes.
a little side note, I got to preach the gospel this morning before breakfast.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, tell us about it.
One of the residents here was looking very downcast at breakfast, and I said, "What's the matter?" I thought maybe she was in pain, and she said, I have never felt so bad about myself as I have since I've been going to Bible study. And she's been going to Bible study with me and others. And I said, because of because of Ephesians? And she said, well, yeah. She says, I just feel really rotten about myself. Well, Ephesians is full of all of these things about you need to be this way and not that way. You know, you can be this way and not that way. And I said, well, that's the gospel. I said, we are sinners. We are saved by grace. And I said, Jesus wouldn't have to come if we could make it on our own and we were righteous. I said, none of us are righteous. And I said, you don't need to feel bad about yourself because Jesus came to save the lost, and that's us.
Okay, good. Now back to our little proverb by Jesus.
Okay.
Jesus is using here sarcasm.
Oh,
I've not come to call the righteous. Getting a little dig in at the Pharisees who saw themselves as the righteous. But we know from reading the New Testament, nobody is righteous on their own, as Becky pointed out. But Jesus came to make us righteous by the grace of God. And he is the physician who's come to heal the sick. Nobody goes to a doctor and says, Doc, I'm here because I'm doing so well. And I've never been sick and I don't need any healing.
that would be nice.
Yeah, but the doctor might say, well, what are you doing coming to me? So Jesus is wanting the Pharisees to recognize the reason Jesus is spending time with sinners and tax collectors is they need salvation. But Jesus can't save anybody who won't admit that they're sinners. And that's one big issue he has with these Pharisees. Okay, well, let's move on then, unless you have something else to say, to another religious issue that comes up between Jesus and the Pharisees, and that is the question of fasting, doing without food or drink for religious purposes. I'll begin reading in chapter 2, verse 18. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for new or fresh wineskins. Okay, Jesus gives a little parable here at the end of this lesson, or two parables really. You don't fast at a wedding, Jesus says. The bridegroom is present even before the wedding in their customs. There would be a week-long celebration usually, feasting, drinking, and celebrating before the wedding takes place. Why don't you fast when the bridegroom is there, Becky?
You know, you're celebrating. You're thankful.
One would hope so. If you're fasting during a wedding, something's wrong with that wedding.
You're the ex-wife.
But you fast when the bridegroom is taken away. Jesus is giving a little foreshadowing of what's going to happen to him. And then he talks about you don't sew a new patch of cloth on an old garment. Now you are a bit of a seamstress, I think. Why wouldn't you put a new patch of cloth, an unshrunk patch of cloth, on an old garment?
Well, if the fabric is pre-shrunk, you put an unshrunk, and when you wash it, it'll pull out.
Right, when you wash it, the new patch will shrink and tear the garment, even worse than it was. Why don't you put new wine in an old wineskin?
Because as the wine ferments, it expands, and the old wineskin is expanded as much as it's going to expand, and the wine will burst it.
Right. New wine is unfermented. I don't know all about the process of fermentation, but I do know, as Becky said, it causes the wine to expand, and the old, more brittle wineskin would burst. Jesus is saying, in effect, I haven't come to just put a patch on an old garment. I have come with something totally new. The kingdom of God is at hand in a way it's never been before. And so the Pharisee disciples don't know why his disciples are not fasting while he's there. Now, let me just mention a little something that happened about maybe 50 to 75 years after this gospel was written. Early Christians wrote a teaching document called the Didache, a Greek word that means teaching. And in part of it, they discussed fasting. And they pointed out Jesus said, don't fast the way the Pharisees do. And then they explained, Pharisees fast on Tuesdays and Fridays. We don't do that. We fast on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Do you think they got Jesus' point? No, they missed the point entirely. It's a different reason for fasting with us. It has to do with Jesus bringing the new wine and the new garment. Okay, let's move on unless you want to say something else there.
Do we fast?
Well, we have the option to. Jesus assumed in some of his teaching, when you fast, that we will fast. But what would be the purposes if we fast?
That's what I was going to ask. I would say it would be to focus your thinking and to um, be aware of your dedication and devotion.
Okay. Christians have always fasted throughout the history of Christianity. Part of fasting in the history as well as in the Bible is to show repentance and sorrow for your sin and to keep turning to God for forgiveness. Part of it is to devote more of your consciousness to religious things rather than material things like food and drink. To give up something to devote yourself to God a little more seriously.
And it doesn't have to be food or drink.
No, it doesn't. You can fast from a lot of things, but it should change your focus to show repentance as well as perhaps other purposes. Shall we move on at this point?
I'm willing.
Okay, let's talk about the Sabbath then in our next little bit. Becky, if you will read please from verse 23 through verse 28.
One Sabbath, as he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not the man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.
Okay. This brings up a question of Sabbath observance. Becky, remind us, please, what the Sabbath was in the time of Jesus.
They observed the seventh day as a day of rest in accordance with Genesis, who said that God rested on the seventh day.
Okay, Sabbath goes all the way back to Genesis and creation, when God created everything in 6 days and rested on the Sabbath. So part of the Jewish religion became observing the Sabbath. The Old Testament said, on the Sabbath you shall do no work. But the question, of course, would come up, especially with religious thinkers like the scribes and Pharisees, what is work? The Bible did not define that. And so they came up with 39 categories of work, which could not be done on the Sabbath. One of those was reaping. And here the Pharisees accused the disciples of Jesus of reaping grain on the Sabbath. Why? Because they were hungry as they went through grain fields, probably wheat fields, could have been barley. So they broke off heads of grain, rubbed them in their hands to separate the wheat from the chaff, and ate it. According to the Pharisees, they were working on the Sabbath. According to Jesus, they were satisfying their hunger.
Which is fine.
Well, but Jesus gives an interesting example from the Old Testament involving David, the great king of Israel and ancestor of the Messiah, Jesus. And he says David did what was not lawful. It didn't have to be interpreted what he did as violating the Sabbath. What was the bread that he took? He apparently entered the tabernacle, and he took some loaves of bread, ate some of it, and gave it to his men.
Well, it was given to the priests.
Yes, this bread, which is called the bread of the presence in the Bible, was only for the priests. Was David a priest? No, he was not. He was from the wrong tribe, Judah rather than Levi. And Jesus says what David did was not lawful. Does that mean we are free to break the law, including the Sabbath, willy-nilly? Now, you want me to try to give an answer?
I would say no, we are not. Then there are examples in the Old Testament of people who did things seemingly unknowingly and were zapped.
Yep.
So,
Well, let's consider a couple of things. One, David is David, not just any Jewish person. He was God's anointed king. And so he apparently had authority when necessary to violate this commandment. Well, Jesus is greater than David. And if he says it's okay for his disciples to violate the Pharisees' interpretation of the Sabbath, then he has authority to do that. But not only that, Jesus, I think, is pointing out it's a matter of priority. Which is a greater need? Keeping a particular interpretation of working on the Sabbath or providing for human needs, in this case hunger. And so Jesus will say, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, because Sabbath was made for human beings, not the other way around. So I think Jesus is emphasizing that the Pharisees have got their priorities all wrong. In fact, he's going to, in a later dispute over the Sabbath, say, you will help your animals on the Sabbath that they fall in the ditch. Is not human need greater than an animal's need? Well, Jesus is claiming authority to reinterpret their understanding of things, like the Sabbath. They don't like it. They see this as an affront to their own place in the religious scheme of authority. And from this point on, they will begin to plot hostile things against Jesus, including his death. Well, I think we've used up all our available time. There's something in the Pharisees' list of rules for the Sabbath, but although this is not a Sabbath. I'm being silly again, but we'll pick up from that point next time. And we'd like to remind you, don't
Don't spend
send
money.
money. But thanks for joining us again. God bless you.